Uhuru, brothers and sisters and comrades. This is Omali Yeshitela. I'm chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, and I'm leader of the International Uhuru Movement. I want to talk to you a bit about this issue of Brittney Griner that has occupied all of the space in ruling class media, certainly here in the United States and probably in other places around the world. But before getting into this discussion, I want to call on you to share. Let's see how many people we can get to join this discussion, because you know it's an important discussion, because all you can see and hear is the United States government pushing this issue about Brittney Griner, where we have an instance where uh, a, a, a really renowned basketball player, woman basketball player, who is a two-time gold medalist, Olympian gold medalist, who several months ago went into Russia and carrying hashish with her, and was arrested by the Russians, charged with illegally bringing in the drug, and actually confessed to having done it, pled guilty, and was sentenced to 9 years in a penal colony. And this has resulted in an extraordinary, dynamic, and interesting kind of response from the United States government. And from the perspective of the United States government, according to them, it is a clear demonstration of how Russia is this autocratic state that oppresses people in general. And it's been really important for the United States to use Brittney Griner, an African woman, as an example of that oppression, that exploitation that the Russians are engaged in. This is in part because the United States government, like much of the whole colonial capitalist world throughout Europe and places also, even like Australia and New Zealand, Canada, much of the whole colonial world is experiencing severe crisis. And the whole colonial mode of production, that is to say, the process through which the peoples of the world engage in activities to produce life. That whole colonial mode of production is being challenged in a fashion that it hasn't been challenged in a very long time. The situation is colonized people around the world rejecting control and domination by the traditional, they are characterized as Western powers, but Europe and European powers that exist in places like the United States. And so this tremendous kind of resistance has occurred. And because it is a colonial mode of production, which means that everything is parasitic, we have a situation where much of the world, much of Europe, all of the United States lives at the expense of colonized peoples around the world. It's been that way for a long time. It's been that way since Portugal attacked Africa more than 600 years and began this process of creating a global economy, a world economy, a single world economy through selling Black people and forcibly dispersing us throughout the world, and initiating the process also that would capture Africa, our Africa. So this captured Africa, this captured colonized people in the Americas and Asia and all of these places, the foundation upon which colonial white power rests. The whole world economy rests on that foundation. And so there is this growing contest of people trying to be free. And as it happened a lot in the 1960s, when the Soviet Union, or Soviet Russia, as the United States and others like to refer to it, was in this contest with the United States for what was the best kind of system that people could live under. And the United States was busy trying to win the world to recognize this capitalism as this progressive and powerful and liberating kind of social system on the one hand. And what the Soviet Union was promoting, the idea that communism, classless society, where nobody lived at the expense of others, was the best kind of society. And so this was a contest that was happening in the world. And this is part of what made it necessary for the United States to do some kinds of things, finally, even around civil rights, to try and undermine what the world was seeing, to obscure the reality of life for Black people in this country. So people were advised that they could ignore the water hoses being used on children in Birmingham, Alabama, or the church bombings and things like that. That was not really representative of America, and that people in Africa and other places, instead of siding with Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union or the Chinese, should look to the United States as the proper model of government. And what this meant was not just who liked the United States or Russia best, but who would have the benefit, which countries would have the benefit of the resources that exist throughout the world, that the colonizer had control for such a long period of time. Revolutionary struggles emerged against colonialism and what have you, people taking back their resources, and some of them dangerously trying to align with Russia or China represented a serious kind of problem. And so that was a kind of contradiction. And the United States, again, was in a place of having to prove that it was the best system. Today, what we've seen, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It no longer is there. But the contest for the world's resources continues to go unabated. And the colonial powers continue to try to hold on to this very oppressive relationship that it has with Africa, that it has with Asia and the Americas and various other kinds of places. It's trying to hold on to that. And people have been fighting for a long period of time. The African People's Socialist Party, I have been talking about how this struggle for our resources creates a fundamental crisis for the existing social system. And this crisis has deepened to such an extent that today the whole economic and political configuration of the world has been changed, transformed right before our very eyes. There are unending wars that are happening where the colonizers are still trying to hold on to Afghanistan, or if they can't hold on to Afghanistan, to punish it in the most serious way, to still trying to hold on to the Persian Gulf, to the forces and throughout South America. This is what the colonial powers are still trying to do. And now many of the oppressed peoples in Africa and these other places are looking to Russia and looking increasingly to China as alternative relationship they would have, rather than with the United States or with China or with the European colonial powers. So this is what is happening. And it's deepened to such a serious extent that it's very clear to everybody that the whole social system is in a state of crisis, and people are trying to be free and looking for alternatives to the United States. The United States still in this contest with Russia and with China. We see all kinds of threats being made, against China, threats being made against Russia. In fact, an actual war has been initiated against Russia, a proxy war against Russia that's been going on most immediately certainly since 2014, after the government of Ukraine was overthrown and assisted in a process that was assisted, if not led, by U.S. intelligence forces. And as that government of Ukraine, it was overthrown precisely because it refused to break relationships with Russia and go with America and what they like to characterize as the West. And since that time, there's a serious confrontation that's been happening with Russia by the United States, but it's been fought indirectly because the United States cannot afford a direct confrontation with Russia, which would mean certain nuclear conflagration. So this is part of what we're looking at. And people are taking sides, and people are for the dismay of the United States. More and more people are refusing to unite with a narrative that's been provided by the United States to explain what's happening in Ukraine. And more people are able to see that Ukraine has been an instrument for carrying out a war by the colonial powers, and particularly by the United States, NATO, and what have you, against Russia. And that has been an objective that more people can see, and more people, despite everything and arm twisting and what have you that the United States has done, it cannot win the majority of the people of the world to its side, to its position, especially when there's this characterization of the existing Ukrainian government having this relationship with fascism or Nazis, as they like to say. And that, of course, the Nazis is one of the fascists, one of the most hated forces for Western, quote unquote, and Democrats with the small d, especially since people had an opportunity to see when this war first started, how the Ukrainians refused to even allow African people to get out of Ukraine, to get pushed Africans from capacity to get on the trains, get on the buses, transportation to get out of Ukraine, to go back to their home countries. People saw that. And so here we have a situation now where the U.S. is in this place and has been in this place for a while now, holding up the Ukraine and the leadership of Ukraine, despite its involvement with what they like to characterize most of the time of the hated Nazis and fascists, etc. Despite all of that, the United States has been promoting, upholding this, and all of the Western powers have been doing the same thing. These are the colonial powers. These are the powers of France and Germany and Italy and the United States and England, all of those countries that built themselves off colonialism and that are the main beneficiaries of the colonial mode of production. Those are the people who've been promoting this war as a just war. And they've been promoting this war because they're losing out increasingly. That colonial mode of production is losing out in part because of people in Venezuela and people in Nicaragua and people in various other places around the world are taking back their resources, creating crisis on that end. And also because people are able to take advantage of new relationships with Russia and with China to the disadvantage of the growing disadvantage of the United States. So that's what we're looking at. And so on today, Brittney Griner was recently returned to the United States. And in preparing for her her return, announcing the fact that she had been freed. Here's what U.S. President, part of what U.S. President Joseph Biden had to say about Griner. He said that moments ago, standing together with her wife, Cheryl, in the Oval Office, I spoke with Brittney Griner. She's safe. She's on a plane. She's on her way home. After months of being unjustly detained in Russia, held under intolerable circumstances, Brittney will soon be back in the arms of her loved ones. And she should have been there all along. This is a day we worked forward for a long time. We've never stopped pushing for her release. It took painstaking and intense negotiation. And I want to thank all the hardworking public servants across my administration who worked tirelessly to secure her release. I also want to thank the UAE for helping us facilitate Brittney's return, because that's where she landed. These past few months have been hell for Brittney and for Cheryl and her entire family and all her teammates back home. People all across the country have learned about Brittney's story, advocated for her release, stood with her throughout this terrible ordeal, and I know that support meant a lot to her family. I'm glad to be able to say that Brittney is in good spirits. She's relieved to finally be heading home, and the fact remains that she's lost months of her life, experienced a needless trauma, and she deserves space, privacy, and time with her loved ones to recover and heal from her time being wrongly detained. So this is just, an excerpt from what Biden had to say about Brittney Griner and the fact that she's now supposedly on her way back to the United States. She's back in the United States now, if I'm not mistaken. So it's really interesting because we have this one person, Brittney Griner. Again, she's a two-time Olympic gold medalist, award-winning person. And this case is being used as evidence of poor treatment of Africans and used as evidence of the autocratic character of Russia. And it's at a time where the United States has tried to create this narrative, this line of the world being divided between democracies with the United States at the helm, and on top of that, and autocracies with Russia and with China and with Iran and other countries that the United States is struggling with now being autocratic countries. That is to say, people have no freedom. They just have freedom in the United States and in England and places that are associated with them. The old colonial powers, the forces that came to power, got their wealth as a consequence, and got their resources, paved their streets, clean water, and all of that as a consequence of colonial domination of Africa, African peoples throughout America, and every place else. And so right now we're looking at a time of what the African People's Socialist Party and I have called an uneasy equilibrium. The whole world is out of balance. This domination of the colonizer and the colonial mode of production is something that's being challenged in a very serious way. And the fact is that progress in the world is something that is being shaped and determined by the struggles of people against colonialism, against oppression. And it's a place where there's a struggle between the past of colonial domination, colonial slavery, and the future of free and liberated people. And so this is the context something that we should really examine and try to come to a better understanding of if we that's really important, especially now at the time of the crisis of the system, at the time where the contradictions are so deep in this world and in this country because of the struggles of colonized and oppressed peoples everywhere and in the United States as well. So let's look at this whole notion that somehow we can determine the character or even the nature of society by the treatment of Brittney Griner in particular. There's another person who was involved in this process, a Russian who the Wall Street Journal said is suspected of being an arms dealer, and he was freed from United States prison and was sent back to Russia as part of this prisoner swap that brought Griner back to this country. But let's look at what the situation is. If we are going to measure the character and the nature of the country based on the treatment of Griner as an African person, and as far as I know, by the way, as an aside, Brittney Griner is the only African in prison in Russia for marijuana or for anything. If there are more people there, certainly it doesn't approach anything like what we see in the United States, where 1 out of every 8 human beings on earth who's locked up in prison is an African in the United States, and where Africans just deal with the issue of marijuana charges, which is what Griner was sentenced for. Africans are 3.6 times more likely than white people, who are the colonizers, to be arrested on marijuana charges. And if you look at the fact, of course, is that the United States has by far the largest prison population per capita in the whole world. And that you look at Louisiana, which has the second largest prison population per capita in the world, Louisiana, where 1,100 per 100,000 people are in prison in that state. And for Africans who are in Louisiana, it's 2,800 in prison per 100,000. And of course, the most notorious prison in Louisiana is Angola, named for a place in Africa, which is a statement about the character and nature of the colonial power of the United States versus what we're looking at in Russia. The United States is only second to Louisiana in terms of per capita people who are locked up in prison at 664 persons per 100,000. In Russia, Russia had 380 people per 100,000 people in prison. In other words, Louisiana's rate of imprisonment per capita is 3 times higher than Russia's. And if you look at Louisiana, you're talking about most of them are Africans versus Russia. And if you look at the reality, Brittney Griner, and we are all sympathetic with for Brittney Griner, this African woman, but in the United States, according to the United States Department of Justice report, that the rate of incarceration for African women is 113 per 100,000, more than twice that of females at 51 per 100,000. So we look at Brittney Griner, we look at the conditions of African people and specifically of African women in the United States. So, and Biden is the one who is the cheerleader for the return of Brittney Griner to the United States. But Biden is also the person who is responsible for many of the people who we're talking about, Africans who are locked up in prison for this crime bill of 1994 that he has even admitted as responsible for this enhanced the just growing numbers of African people shoved into prisons throughout this country. And then, of course, this Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which Biden is responsible for in 1994. And this bill reinforced the existing piece of legislation, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which created this huge disparities in sentencing between crack cocaine, which was something that was manufactured in a laboratory and put in African communities by the CIA. And anybody can learn about this now. You can Google this. It's such a well-known fact. In fact, our slogan used to be in the African People's Socialist Party that the White House that is the crack house, the rock house, and Uncle Sam is the pushing man. So 1994, this Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, pushed by Biden and the police department, reinforced this legislation that was called the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which created this huge disparity between people who are in prison with this crack cocaine derivative, that was created specifically for African people. And then the white colonizer cocaine, powder cocaine. And so under this bill that Biden's law helped to reinforce, a person was sentenced to a 5-year minimum sentence, for 5 grams of cocaine, of crack cocaine. But it took 500 grams of powdered cocaine, that is to say the majority colonizer white drug, it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to trigger the same sentence. So this is what we're looking at in terms of making these comparisons that the United States has asked us to make in terms of the treatment of African people by the United States government, especially around drugs and things of that nature, democratic rights, and by Russia. So the fact is that we are looking at a serious crisis of the existing social system, domestically and internationally. It's volatile, and that African people are growing desperate in our struggles for freedom. And the United States has positioned itself as the leading democratic force, its shining city on the hill, with more people becoming disenchanted with the colonial mode of production and looking for alternatives to U.S. and colonial domination. It's increasingly important for the United States to show that it is the model for democracy versus Russia and China, who are making inroads into political and economic spaces once dominated by the United States. And as we have this discussion, I think that it's really important for us to talk about that it was the United States that attacked the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party, on July 29th on basic democratic questions. The right to participate in elections, to participate in the electoral process that's been held up and promoted as the primary way that people who live in this country, the United States, should be able to advance our interests. Yet, when we do so and use the electoral process to raise the question of reparations, Black community control of the police, the return of resources stolen from African people, when we do this and put the pushback gentrification that's happening to Africans throughout this country, we are attacked by the federal government and claim with the claim that the Russians are the ones who are responsible for this and not African people. That's a democratic right that's supposed to be available to everybody. I don't know if people in Russia can vote or not, if they have to face pre-dawn raids at 5 o'clock in the morning with the grenades and massive military forces attacking them for that. On July 29th, we're talking about making the distinction between Russia and the United States that the Biden administration has imposed on us. This discussion, the Biden administration, United States government has imposed on us and said that that we are allegedly, the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement, allegedly guilty of dissenting against the U.S. political line in terms of why it's engaged the struggle between Russia and Ukraine as it's being posited. And so we don't even have the right to have a different opinion. They didn't put Brittney Griner in jail because she had a different opinion. They put her in jail because she brought drugs, and she pleaded guilty to the charge of having brought the drugs into the city, into Russia, which was against the law. I'm not saying that wasn't a potent, an exaggerated sentence. I don't know if it was or not. She said, I didn't know that I was breaking the law. But in the United States, they like to brag about the fact that ignorance of the law is no excuse. But that's not what's happening. Of course, what's happening is the United States and Russia are involved in this contest now. The United States is fighting for its very life. And Brittney Griner, a Black person, Black people, the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement, all of us are being used as pawns in the struggle for the United States to try to hang on as the preeminent political, colonial, economic force in the world. And then, of course, the fact that the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement actually tried to use the democratic process of going to the United Nations, collecting signatures on petitions that charges the United States with violation of the convention, the United Nations Convention on punishment and the crime of prevention and punishment of genocide. I mean, this is something that Black people have been doing almost since the Genocide Convention was created in 1948. By 1952, African people were at the United Nations saying the United States is guilty of this. We don't have the right to complain. We don't have the right to say that. That's what we are being told. But we have also been told that that Russia is the culprit here, and Brittney Griner is an example of how brutal Russian society and Russian justice is. So the fact is that I saw Brittney Griner's wife was at the press conference with Biden, and she was, quoted with saying how happy she is, and we're happy for her, and how she and Brittney are going to work for freedom of the others left in Russia. And the others left in Russia includes a so-called former Marine and somebody who is some kind of security contractor who looks like it might be a spy. And so they're going to be working to get the others out, to the freedom of the others, they said, left in Russia. And so, we are disappointed in that statement. We are extremely disappointed because if anything, if she thought there was something wrong with being arrested for marijuana, then Sherelle, Brittney's wife, and Brittney would be working for the freedom of all the Africans who have been locked up on marijuana, drug charges, and otherwise inside the United States. But of course, none of that has happened. And one of the reasons it cannot happen is because of colonialism and colonial mode of production that dominates all life in the world, that exists for peoples of the world who are participating within the context of the global economy, even though people are struggling against it and creating crisis after crisis because of the struggle against it. So that's what we're looking at. And so this thing about Brittney Griner, I just hate being used, and we're not chumps, and the United States government is attempting to pimp us by saying that somehow what's happening to Griner in Russia is an example of oppression and exploitation. And we've heard that Brittney Griner is now free. But of course, that's a lie. She can't be free because she is an African, and she might come to the United States under the illusion of being free. But the reality is that African people in the United States are colonized. And I think it's extremely significant that the United States would say that Russia freed Brittney Griner, because I think part of what the United States, and we hear all the time, anytime masses of African people have been engaged in struggle for the last 100 years or so, struggling against colonialism, struggling, that included even people like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois and others. It was always said, the African People's Socialist Party, that somehow it was the Russians who were responsible for this issue of freedom that we were fighting for. Now the United States government is telling us that Russia has forgotten about everybody else except Brittney, that the Russians have freed Brittney Griner. And I posit to you, I tell you that Brittney is not free. And if she thinks so right now, she'd better be careful on her way from the airport where she landed to her home, because there's a great possibility that she could become one of those African women in the United States who are filling the prisons for the most casual and ridiculous kinds of charges. So what we're saying is that what has to happen, brothers and sisters and comrades, first of all, we just tired of being used like that. And we do have the ability to think, and we do have the ability to come to conclusions different from those which are put forward to us by those who are responsible for exploitation and oppression. We say that it's extremely important for African people to be free, for Africa to be liberated, for every square inch of Africa to be free. We say the United States government should drop any of the allegations made against the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement simply because we tried to exercise what's supposed to be the rights of free speech, what's supposed to be the right to participate in elections and things like that in this country, what's supposed to be freedom of association. We say the United States government should immediately end this aggression against us, and that you, brothers and sisters and comrades, should demand that be the case. And so if we want to, and I'm not opposed to this, we can welcome Brittney Griner here to the United States, but we should not fall into this trap of assuming that her coming back to the United States means that she is free. The fact of the matter is, African coming to the United States is what ended our freedom. That's how we got to the United States. And it wasn't Russia that did this. And it's worth mentioning that her last name is Griner. It is not a Russian last name, which is to say that the colonizer for the people who associated with Brittney Griner was one of the Western colonizers, Europe, the Americans, and it wasn't Russian. That's why she doesn't have a Russian last name. Brothers and sisters, comrades, go to apspuhuru.org, support the African People's Socialist Party, demand hands off Uhuru, hands off Africa, and then demand that all of those African people who the United States has stuffed in prisons, even after it's talking all this talk about making marijuana legal and selling marijuana legally and what have you. They got all these Africans rotting in prisons throughout this country. We have to demand their freedom. I want to thank you so much, brothers and sisters. Again, this is Omali Yeshitela, chairman of the African People's Socialist Party and leader of the International Uhuru Movement. Is relate to Africa. We say freedom all, Uhuru.